Hello, this is John Chandler. Once again, I'm going to take you today down a little journey into the past, and we're going to look at something that I think has been a little bit neglected. And when people are looking at this period of history that we call the Middle Ages, because it's perhaps in some respects not the most romantic aspect of this world, because it's sort of the middle classes, and it's not necessarily to do with warfare. But it touches upon many of the things that are interesting, and it's the class that creates a lot of wealth and has a lot of social mobility, and it was really important for this period. So today we're going to look at the forgotten middle class of urban medieval Europe, and we're specifically going to be looking at Central Europe and Central Northern Europe. A lot of what you're going to hear today also would apply for much of Northern Italy and some other regions, not as much precisely for Western Europe and the British Isles, which is usually, if you're an English speaker, this is what you're going to be more familiar with. And there's reasons for that we'll explore in a minute. But so the focus today is going to be on the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, which is going to be a little bit unfamiliar for some people, but there's a reason for that, which we'll see in a minute. So I'm going to briefly go over what an artisan was in this period. And we'll talk about where the artisans were found and where most of them were, and the literature that has to do with them. Because today, instead of just opining and instead of hearing my interpretations of what all this stuff was and what the sources mean, we're going to look directly at three sources. And there's a reason for that. This is an ongoing goal for me in doing these videos, is that I want to introduce some of the good sources to people that are interested in these subjects, because the truth is that we don't know that much about this period, but there's a huge amount of literature from then. It's just that a lot of it has not been transcribed and translated into modern languages. But with the advent of the internet in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a lot of these wonderful ancient manuscripts and books have been scanned and put online, so that you have websites that you can just go to and page through photographs of the actual book. And as you'll see in a minute, these are really detailed, rich sources. And we're really going to be looking mainly at the images today, because some of these books that we're looking at in this video, I couldn't find any translations. If there are full English translations of these available anywhere and you know about it, please let me know in the comments. But we can learn a lot from the images, and I've been studying this for about 20 years, so I have gained some insight into interpreting it. More importantly, I'm going to be opening a door to a tunnel that goes all the way back 5-6 centuries in the past, so that you can explore if you're interested. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, the bad news is everything that we hear in English about the Middle Ages is mostly wrong or applicable to the British Isles, maybe a little bit to France, but the most dynamic and interesting parts, arguably, in the Middle Ages are Italy and Flanders and the Holy Roman Empire and places like Poland and Czechia, and parts of Russia and in the Iberian Peninsula, where there was a lot more dynamism, and where a lot of what the art and the culture and the technology, the improvements in architecture and weapons and machinery and the development of tools and things like that comes out of these parts of Europe. And then, as much later on, the era of the heyday of the British Isles, is arguably maybe the later Tudor period under Queen Elizabeth or something like that. But for the Middle Ages, we really want to look at this other part of Europe, and we'll explore as to why that is. So I'm going to dive right in. What is an artisan? The artisans are arguably the skilled working class and the middle classes of urban Europe, particularly in this part of Central Europe and Northern Europe that we're talking about today. They either make things in the sense that they are manufacturing, or they provide services. This is what they do. So the manufacturing side, it's very different from modern manufacturing, even though they did rely on machinery and mechanization and even some automation more than we might think, or more than you would expect, maybe. But it's a different mindset, and it's a different approach to production today. The goal is not just to make the most stuff the cheapest way possible. It was to make things beautiful and well, and to make it in a manner that it would last. There's no built-in obsolescence, and there's reasons for that. There's economic reasons for that, which we talk about later. The services could be anything from like working on a dock as a stevedore to running a shop. most artisans were in production, but there were some also that did the services. So artisans, everybody's probably heard of an apprentice, and a lot of people have heard of a journeyman. These are terms that go back to the tradition of craft artisans. And they also existed for merchants, which is sort of the upper class in these towns where you find most of the artisans. But an apprentice is somebody that, as a child, is sent by their parents to go work for a master crafts person. So it could be, usually it's a craftsman, sometimes it's a craftswoman, who will give them room and board, give them instruction in how to perform a craft, and in return, they're going to do a lot of the more menial work in the workshop. And once they reach a certain age and they have progressed, and if they don't get in serious trouble, they'll become a journeyman. And in this period, a journeyman really meant something in the sense that you took a journey. So the apprentice gets there when they're maybe, let's say, 12. They work for a couple of years, and then at age 15 or 16, they're going to go hit the road as a journeyman. And what that meant is that they've got to leave town. They have to stay 50 miles away from town. They wear usually a special outfit. They have a kind of a passport called a Wanderbuch, which is they're going to present when they get to another town. They'll make their way across the countryside, getting room and board by helping out like the country people, the peasants, Bauern in German. But what they're trying to do is get to workshops in other towns, and they have little journeyman societies that'll help them out when they're on the road. They'll give them a traveling penny and so on. But they're looking to get into another workshop, do some work, and learn how their craft. Let's say they're a weaver or a baker or a sword maker. They're going to see how things are done in other places, and they'll travel all over Europe and beyond. Some of these people went into the Mamluk regions in North Africa. Some of them went into the Ottoman Empire. They traveled around a lot. They call it the tramp or the waltz. And after they do that for a specific period of time, which would depend on the craft, a year in some cases, sometimes as much as 3 years, usually it's about a year, they'll either go back to where they started if they wanted to, or maybe they have found a good opportunity in another place. And this is also part of the reason for the waltz, or the journey that the journeymen go on, is to go find places where there's a demand for what they do. You might already have a lot of bakers in the town that you came from if you're a baker, and you get to some other place where, hey, these people don't even know how to make pretzels yet, and I know how to make really good pretzels. I'm going to make money here. So you want to open a shop there. And then in order to get in as a guild master, which is the third rank, they have to create their masterpiece. And this is basically, they have to perform some task, often making something. They call this Meisterwerk. You maybe, if you're a cutler, you're going to make a beautiful sword, or if you're a baker, you're going to make a fantastic array of bread and pastries and stuff. It's all specified in the guild regulations. And then when the other masters say, okay, yeah, this person can do the job, then you'll be able to open a workshop, and that's also when you can get married and start having kids. So there's another incentive to get there. And then it's possible for some of these people that they'll have a fourth rank, which is alderman, where they're basically part of the leadership of their craft. And one other thing, just very quickly, and I'm not going to get deep into this because that's for a good subject for another video, but artisans did have guilds. They also had craft organizations, and a lot of people, I think, in a lot of American kind of, let's say, academic adjacent literature that talks about the Middle Ages or talks about this subject specifically, they confuse the two things. So the craft organization is just regulating the craft. It means, we're going to make sure that people are taking care of the apprentices that are working for them, and they're getting proper training. We're going to make sure that the things that we produce or the services that we give out are going to be of value and of the standard of the town. And the reason is that the towns competed with each other. So one town would be, weaving a certain type of textile, let's say linen or fustian, or they might be weaving wool or possibly silk or some other things. And if they're not doing it well, then somebody's going to go buy it from another town. So the town had to maintain a certain standard. And that's mostly what the craft organization did. Then there's the guild. The guilds came in different varieties. Guilds could be basically religious organizations. They could be confraternities, what we call in New Orleans a social aid and pleasure club that might be built around carnival or some of the other celebrations that took place through the year. It could be a military organization, but they were also political. So the guilds were like often combinations of different crafts, and they would be a way for the crafts to exert influence in the town. So the place where we find these artisans, and where we find artisans who were really at their peak flowering of productivity and creativity, which is what kind of creates the Renaissance. This late medieval and really all the way back to the high medieval, 12th, 13th century through, let's say, the sort of middle 16th, where there's this explosion in cultural development, art, architecture, technology, weaponry, machinery, tools, production of books and literature, which is really what we're focusing on today. A lot of this had to do with the unleashing of this group of people, this class of people, or to use a correct medieval term, the estate of the artisan. And the place that we find most of these people in are in the free cities in particular. So what this means is a city with a certain degree of autonomy. And I'm going to just really quickly go through what that meant. In the Middle Ages, we had some cities that were true city-states, where the city was its own little country. And that was mostly in Russia and Italy. And there's some other places, like there's on the Dalmatian coast, for example. You have Ragusa, which is Dubrovnik today. That was a city-state. And in Russia, you had Veliki Novgorod, or most people just call it Novgorod, but there's two towns with that name. Tver and Pskov, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, so please forgive me. But those were true city-states that had come out of the old Kievan Rus, and were nominally under the control of the Mongols in the later Middle Ages, and were rivals of Muscovy, which was directly under control by the Mongols. But they really were city-states. And in Italy, cities like Venice, Genoa, Milan, Florence, Siena, and many of these were republics. The Veliki Novgorod, Tver, and Pskov were republics, as was Venice, Genoa, Florence, Siena, and at a certain point, Milan. Some of them ended up being taken over by foreign countries or taken over by their own mercenaries, as happened in Milan with Sforza. But some of them remained republics for a really long time. The longest lasting was Venice, which was a republic all the way to the 18th century, ruled by kind of an oligarchy of merchants. Then the next step below that is the free city, which is a city that more or less acknowledges that, hey, we're part of a nation. In this case, usually the Holy Roman Empire. And they have a tacit agreement to cooperate with the emperor, but they're not vassals of the emperor. So there's a few cities that had that status of a true free city, a Freistaat. For example, Lübeck and Dansk or Danzig up in the far north. But those were kind of rare. And then below that level, you have the free imperial or free royal city, there was a lot of. There was a couple hundred of those. Depending on the time period, sometimes more than that. These cities were subject to the emperor only. So what that meant is they have what's called imperial immediacy. There's nobody above them except the emperor. And usually in the Holy Roman Empire, with a couple of exceptions, usually the emperor were fairly weak, and they were not able to really demand much from the cities. The main obligation these cities had was to contribute some troops in times of war, especially if it's a war that threatens the whole empire, the whole region, let's say. And then below that, you have royal cities and imperial cities, which have some degree of autonomy, but maybe some of the rights are controlled by regional princes or regional prelates, means like a bishop or an archbishop or an abbot or something. And then below that, you have the territorial towns, which are directly under the thumb of a prince. So mostly it's the free cities and the free imperial cities, and to some extent the royal cities and imperial cities where we'll see a lot of the artisans that are really flowering in their productivity. And this is where artisans often had a say in the government. How much power politically the artisans had depended on what type of town it was. So you have these fully autonomous towns and the partially autonomous towns. They may be economically more oriented toward manufacturing, toward producing things, or they may, and a lot of times those would be the towns in the interior, or they may be really much more oriented toward trade, which is a lot of times towns that are on the coast or on the sea or on a really big river. But you also have quite a few towns that are kind of hybrids. They're a little bit of both. And the ones that we're going to look at today are, in fact, hybrids. So one other thing that relates to this is where we see the production of books and where we see high rates of literacy. And those also correlate. So we can see, looking at a map of where most of the autonomous towns were, that compares very well to this map that shows where all the incunabula are, which is these are the printed books before 1500. It's a special term that was invented for this specific thing, because the Gutenberg movable type printing press is invented in 1450, and originally there's one, and then there's two, and there's three. By the end of the 15th century, there's hundreds of them, and they're producing books all over, as you can see on this map. And it's certain regions which is where you'll find most of them. You can see that southern Germany, the Rhineland, Flanders, northern Italy, and kind of a line along the northern coast where the Hanseatic cities are. This is where most of the printing was being done. So this is where we get most of the books. And most of the towns where the printing presses were set up, as printing presses exploded in popularity and significance, already had paper mills, and they already had bookmaking industries. They had scriptoria where people would copy books. So this is where we're focusing, and we're specifically today going to look at sources from two cities that are in the sort of northeastern part of Europe, but they're in the southern end of that. So specifically, we're going to be looking at Nuremberg and Krakow. So Nuremberg is today in Germany, and it was then in the Holy Roman Empire, but close to the border with Bohemia, which is where the Czechs are from. And Krakow, which is a major trading partner for Nuremberg, is in southern Poland. And they're closely connected because in the medieval period, throughout Central and Northern Europe, a lot of the cities had large German populations because the Germans had an industry of founding and sort of reorganizing towns, and that had happened in Krakow. So there's a large population of Germans there, and they're very close trading partners with Nuremberg. We're going to look at three sources, and again, as I was saying in the beginning, this is a little bit better sometimes than reading the interpretive literature or the secondary literature, because we really don't know that much, nearly as much as we ought to, about this region. And there's a huge quantity of literary sources full of data that just really hasn't been processed yet. It hasn't been translated. It hasn't been looked at very carefully. So it can be really helpful to kind of bypass the modern tropes and the filters, and go right to the source. Now that can also sometimes get you in trouble. And the key thing to remember is the past is a foreign country. You don't want to offend the locals. Don't jump too rapidly or too rigidly into your own interpretations and conclusions, but enjoy the journey, because it's a great journey. So we're going to be, and before I go any further, I just want to say one more time, my pronunciation is not very good. I am not a native German or Polish speaker. I don't really have any Latin. I have a little bit of German, and I know a few Polish words that have to do with fencing, but bear with me. I'm going to do my best. We're going to look at three sources. So the first one is called the Balthasar Behem Codex. It was created in Krakow in 1505. And what that one is a great big book of craft regulations for all the artisans. And it includes, sort of as a decoration in this really big book, about 30 paintings that are depictions of artisans doing their jobs. And they're very amusing and interesting watercolor paintings we're going to look at. And then the second source is called the Housebook of the 12 Brothers of Nuremberg. And this one was, as a house book, it was like kept in this place for a long period of time. It seems to have started somewhere around 1422 to 1425, and it goes all the way to the 19th century. So it covers a vast length of time. And what this was a kind of a retirement home for poor artisans. And whenever they died, they would create a portrait of the artisan that had been. They always took care of 12 people. It was established to take care of 12 poor artisans that maybe their family had died out, or they ended up without any support, and so they would be taken care of at this sort of retirement home. And then when they died, they did a portrait of them doing their job. So it gives us some insight into what their job was. And then finally, another book called the Ständebuch by a guy called Jost Amann, who was an artist, a woodcutter originally from Zurich, but this book was also done in Nuremberg, in a workshop at Nuremberg. All three of these books are scanned and they're available online, and the scans are really good and very easy to work with. And I'll have links to that in the notes at the end. So let's jump right in. So the first one is the Balthasar Behem Codex, which is also known as the Codex Picturatus. It was produced in Krakow in 1505. It's handwritten, an enormous size, 754 pages. This is not at all unusual. This is one of the things that's sort of surprising about medieval literary sources. You would expect, today we have computers and word processors and printers and all this automation, and that makes it. I mean, I can just get I can prompt an AI to write a book, right? And in this period, books were written, especially in any way that the book was produced, whether it was with a Gutenberg press or by hand. It's a lot of work. But so you would think maybe they're going to be short and perfunctory, but no, they're not. They're long. Everybody that's producing treatises and in this case, this is kind of a government book of all the rules and regulations for the crafts in this city of about maybe 20,000 people. But they're always big. Not always, but if you're going to just guess how big a book is going to be, it's going to be big in this period. So Krakow is a very interesting place. It was for a long time in those days. It was the royal capital of Poland. There's a castle there called Wawel Castle that has a wonderful legend about it, about a dragon. Dragon lived in a cave under the castle, and a local hero killed the dragon, and then it ended up they built a castle on top of the hill. By the way, you can go see the bones. I think they think that these are mastodon bones, but supposedly those are the dragon bones that are hanging outside of. I think they're outside of the cathedral, somewhere in Krakow. The town was originally a Polish Slavic community that was located by German citizens in the 13th century, having been invited by a local duke. And what this means is that the Germans had an industry of surveying towns where they would go out and basically plan out a town so that it was going to be made out of stone and brick instead of what the older towns were made out of wood. And they would survey the drainage and where to get the water supplies, and they were just very good at establishing this technology of making a city, which was pretty tricky. It's hard to make a city work, as we can see. Where I live, theoretically, I'm in a city, but it's not working that well. The Krakow became militarily and economically very important for Poland, and intellectually, you can say too. The population remained substantially German-speaking for a long time. This gets a little complicated because towns in this era did not have as high of a birth rate as the countryside, so people are coming in. The birth rate of the locals in the town, the burghers, is not at replacement rate. So they're always having people coming in to build up the population. And some of those people are coming from other German towns, like the journeymen that are coming, but a lot of them are going to be local. So gradually, the ethnicity turns local, whatever local, they've got towns like this in Sweden and Finland and all throughout the Baltic and several places in Poland. But so a lot of the people here are by this time are probably Polish ethnicity or mixed ethnicity, but the language of the government in the town is mostly German. And this book that we're going to be looking at is written actually in Latin, German, and Polish. So it's mostly German. But Krakow remained loyal to the Polish crown. When Poland went to war against German polities like the Teutonic Order or the Habsburgs down in Austria, the townfolk in Krakow remained loyal to the Polish king for a good reason, because the Poles had no problem. The Polish monarchy generally went along with the idea of the autonomous city. There was also a large Jewish population in this town, particularly in one of the three municipalities that was called Kazimierz. This was in part because Poland had some specific laws that protected Jews, and also as time went on, Poland got increasingly strong religious freedom laws. And this largely had to do with Poland merging with Lithuania. There was also substantial communities of at least a few hundred Italians, Hungarians. There were some Czechs and some Flemish people. Krakow was also a university town. So the first university in Poland, which is called Jagiellonian University, and which was one of like the first 3 or 4 in Northern Europe, was founded by King Casimir III in 1364. So universities were kind of rare, especially in this part of the world at the time. So having a university there was really important. It really meant that you had a lot of very well-educated people that were skilled professionals, which is above the level of a craft artisan. We'll talk about them on some other video. The first printing press in Krakow was created in 1465 or maybe 1468. I've seen different sources, by a guy called Gunther Zeiner, who came in from Augsburg, or possibly it was one of his journeymen. The first incunabula, which is the printed, something that has survived, that's a printed book or manuscript from the era that was before 1500, was a calendar, a wall calendar that was produced in the print shop of Caspar Straub in 1474. And they think the astronomy part of it, the calendar itself, was created by a Polish astrologer named Petrus Gazovic. Krakow was a little unusual in that they got a paper mill later. They got their paper mill developed in 1491. Usually the paper mill comes first. But they were pretty close to several other towns that did have paper mills, so they didn't have to import paper all the way from Italy or anything. So what we're going to look at, we're not looking at all 754 pages of this book. We're just going to look at the illustrations, and we're going to just start right here with the merchant. So merchants were a separate class than the artisans, but a lot of artisans would start to become merchants. There was an in-between level. And so when you have, sometimes there would be conflicts, uprisings, and little factional disputes, and even civil wars in these towns. And there's always some merchants that are sort of the lower level merchants that are with the artisans. And then there's some that are the really wealthy merchants that are, what you might call today like brokers, who are the, with the, what was called the patriciate, or the ruling class, the really high wealth level urban landowners. So this is probably one of your hardworking merchants, one of the merchants that's sort of down on the artisan level. And you can see he's here with I think one of his customers. So you can see that the merchant's sort of dressed for the road. He's wearing practical looking clothing for the dealing with the weather, and he's armed. And the noble is wearing the outfit of the sarmatist outfit of the Polish nobility, which is they would have these silk fabrics and these big coats, and they would have hats or sort of like turbans, and they had developed an idea of the origins of the Polish nobility. So you can see an interesting contrast, because you're going to be a lot of these. The merchant is armed because the roads are dangerous. Getting to and from these cities was risky because of robber knights and bandits, and even like wild animals and weather, and bridges getting washed out by floods and everything you can imagine. And I like to point out, this is a wonderful painting by Albrecht Dürer. A lot of people have heard of, a very famous German artist from Nuremberg. And it's a depiction of a merchant named Oswald Krell, who was a member of the Granz Ravensburg Company, which was from South Germany, but was sort of spread out all over the place. And that was kind of a coalition of a bunch of merchant families. And you'll notice that, first of all, Oswald himself, who was said to be a somewhat impulsive character, you can see in his eyes, he's kind of a hardcore dude. And on either side of his portrait are these depictions of these guys with fur all over their bodies, with shields and clubs. This is the German Wildermann, the wild man. This is kind of like the German version of Bigfoot. And it's a very popular concept in German culture. You'll see it all over German art from this period. And I believe in this portrait, where you see this kind of tough guy merchant, and he's very well dressed. He's got the black color of his clothing. That's one of the most expensive colors that you could wear, with the fur lining, and he's got jewelry on. But you can see his eyes. This kid is ready for trouble, and that's because he's probably running into trouble on the road. Somebody has probably almost certainly tried to rob this guy at one point or another. And so the wild man represents the adventure and the danger and the mystery of the road, the unpredictability. And it also represents the unpredictability of some of these people who were resourceful. They were good at thwarting the robbers. Otherwise, they couldn't do their job. So the next one here is a kramer. It means a shopkeeper. Kramarze, I think, in Polish. This particular shopkeeper is a woman, and this is a thing that we're going to see all through this. That women were part of this artisan world, and they could also be merchants as well, much more than you might expect. And in fact, we actually have some records of a female merchant from Krakow. From 1481, there was a woman named Greta Grazer, and there's an inventory from a document showing that she had a shop with imported cloth, linen, and spices, a total of 44 different goods for the value of 287 Hungarian florins were in her shop, which is roughly worth about $50,000 or 50,000 euro in today's currency. Very rough estimate. Tricky estimating these things. But then, by contrast, in the same year, there's another stall owned by a woman named Jadwiga Hazinska, which is I think a Polish name, and she had contents that included gloves and purses and a bunch of other little bags, and the total value was worth 3 florins and 20 groschen, which is worth about 800 euro. So you can see a pretty wide range of economic status, but still, somebody making a buck. And there were plenty of women that did this. So a shopkeeper, this is actually what the nobles used to refer to all of the artisans as, because a lot of the artists that were producing things also had a shop. If you had let's say a sword maker, you would have a shop where he would sell his blades. In some cases, now sometimes they wouldn't sell directly to the public. They were working in networks of contractors and subcontractors. But a lot of times they were open to the public, and there were specific rules about that because there's a lot of sort of transparency rules. They actually had the workshop open to where you could see what people were doing in there. That was part of the town law. So this next one is a furrier, which in German is Kirschner, and Polish, I think it's Furkiniki, something like that. I'm not even going to try it. I believe that the furrier is the guy on the right, and the guy on the left is another Polish nobleman. And you can see a really interesting contrast in fashions and attitude here. There's Balthasar Behem Codex, whoever the artist was, which I don't know who the artist was, it's very playful. There's a lot of humor in this. So we can see that the guy on the left is in that Sarmatian attire. He's got a fur-lined coat. He's got a little small dog, which seems to be a sign of wealth. It's sort of an indication of somebody can afford to take care of their pets. The furrier on the right is probably on watch duty or militia duty. He's carrying a halberd. You can see that his clothes are just a ridiculous array of different colors and patterns, and this is very typical for burghers in Germany in this era, or in this case in Poland. But the burghers were able to flaunt the sumptuary laws to some extent. So there were these laws that said what kind of things you were allowed to own based on what class you were. And earlier in the medieval world, only nobles could have nice stuff. But as towns became more autonomous, they pushed the limits on that, and they kind of got rid of a lot of these rules. And inside the town, nobles can't tell people what to wear. The sumptuary laws that they did have in town, which were much more limited, were going to be basically a matter of sort of an issue between the ruling strata of the town, the richer merchants and so on, versus the poorer artisans. But generally speaking, the burghers flaunted those rules, and you can see this guy. He's also kind of slouching. He's probably bored because he's on watch duty. But there's a lot of attitude there. He's the nobleman on the left is standing with good posture, and he's kind of glaring at this furrier. Furriers were really important in Krakow in particular because it was the furrier's gate, which was sort of the center of the town walls of Krakow, and those were created in the 13th century. Very, very, very fortuitously, Krakow got involved in some fighting, some drama that was going on between two Polish dukes in that region that were both from the old ruling family, the Piast family in Poland, and they sided with the duke that had started out as more or less their overlord, and they protected his family in the castle. There was a castle in Krakow, and when he had to flee and go to Hungary to get reinforcements, and he came back with his reinforcements, and his family had been spared, even though his rival was trying to buy off the family from the burghers. The burghers stayed loyal. So after that, he gave them. This was in 1285, and he gave them the right to build stone walls. Up to that point, the town probably had a ditch and a wooden palisade, but very quickly, the burghers of Krakow built stone walls, and each road that goes into the city had a gate that was controlled by a different one of the crafts, by a guild, one of the crafts. The main gate of Krakow was the St. Florian Gate, or also known as the Furrier's Gate, and it was completed just probably a few months before the third Mongol invasion of Poland in 1287. Which, I don't know if you know anything about the Mongols, that is serious big trouble. And the previous two Mongol invasions, the population had either hidden in the castle, and anybody that couldn't fit in the castle or didn't get in before they closed the gates had to go run and hide in the woods, which is probably not a lot of fun. In this case, however, the walls held, and so these craft artisans were a major part of the militia. And so, believe me, after the St. Florian Gate helped fight off the Mongols, the status of the furriers went up in the town. Furriers are also very closely linked to the fencing tradition that was going on in Central Europe, that we see maybe 100 years after this starting up. That at least that is in terms of what shows up in the record. So around the time of the book, the Balthasar Behem Codex, we have these fencing guilds already established, like the Marksbrüder, and then later comes the Freifechter von der Feder. These groups were practicing this sort of hidden or secret fencing martial art, fencing and grappling, and lots of other kinds of fighting martial art that was called Kunst des Fechtens in German. And when we look at the people who were participating in these events and that were the fencing masters, a lot of them were furriers, and particularly the Brotherhood of St. Mark, or the Marksbrüder. Many of those folks were furriers. So there's very interesting tie-ins with the furriers here, and that may be the fact that the furriers depicted here with a weapon might have something to do with that. They're certainly a prominent guild. One other thing that's important to mention about furriers is that they were producing felt, which was used inside of clothing. And it wasn't it wasn't just furs and clothing made directly out of furs, but it was this felt, which is made from the inner lining of the fur from rabbits and beaver, especially. Was used for all kinds of stuff, because you got to remember, in this period, nobody has central heating, and it gets very cold in Northern Europe in the winter. Okay, so anyway, moving on. The next one, this one's a tailor's workshop. So you can see that we've got a husband and wife managing some customers and working, and this is one of these cases where the workshop is also the storefront. And you can see that there's the customers are in there checking out some of the goods. The husband and wife here are working as a team, and this is a very common theme that we're going to see in all of these. The marriage traditions in Northern Europe are very different from in the South. The husband and the wife are usually around the same age, usually in their mid-20s, let's say around 25. And the husband would get a dowry from the wife's family, but the husband or his family would also give the wife a kind of reverse dowry, which in Poland was called a mourning gift. And this was sort of a mortgage, usually on some property somewhere that was, and it also could be, some gold or something that she could keep in a chest that would be insurance in case the husband died or something happened to the husband. And she, so that she could take care of herself. So they had kind of an equal basis, and a lot of them ran these businesses really together. And we'll see more of that. Next one is a rainmaker, as in not as in rain coming water from the sky, but reins as the reins of a horse. And in this picture, the horse has the most attitude. The horse is sort of stealing the show, I think. He knows he's getting some new reins and he's ready for some good ones, or maybe he needs some reins because he's got a very strong personality. You'll notice that the artisan here is also wearing quite a garish combination of colors and patterns once again. The next one here is a goldsmith. The goldsmith is a really important craft because obviously if you're working with gold, I mean, if you know somebody that's got a shop that sells things, that's one level of income. Somebody that has a shop that sells gold, that's another level of income. And especially in the Middle Ages. This also would apply to silversmiths and anybody that's working with precious metals. The goldsmith was a high status craft, and it's a craft that had a lot of social mobility up above the level of an artisan, because golds for two reasons: because goldsmiths, because they had a lot of money, they could become merchants, and also because goldsmiths, if they were very talented artists, could become sort of friends with, very wealthy patricians and merchants, and also even nobles and princes. This was not unusual. This also coincided with the fact that there was a lot of metal engraving that started taking place in the 15th century, and Nuremberg was a center of this, where guys like Albrecht Dürer, Martin Schongauer were creating these engravings on copper plates and on steel plates, that instead of making a painting where you would work for 3 or 4 years for some bishop and then maybe hopefully get paid, you could make an engraving, which is something you would learn as a goldsmith, how to make very fine lines and draw in reverse, because you're going to make a stamp that's going to go onto you're going to make a die that's going to stamp the coins out. Well, the same thing applies to an engraving, and you know how to do it backwards, and then you can make basically a poster, a print that can be sold over and over and over and over again. So instead of selling it to this one rich bishop or to a duke or something for, let's say the equivalent of tens of thousands of euro, but it took you multiple years to finish it, and they may not pay you, you can sell a whole bunch of them for 20 or 30 euro equivalent to the entire rest of the middle class, and that's freedom. So you have a lot of these artists like Albrecht Dürer, Urs Graf, Benvenuto Cellini, Wenzel Jamnitzer, who were actually goldsmiths. These famous artists were like Dürer his family would come out of a goldsmith, but Urs Graf, Cellini, Jamnitzer, those were all goldsmiths. There's a lot of other ones. I'm going to do a whole video just on that. But Nuremberg was a center of that, and so this coincided with the arrival of the printing press in the 15th century and later. Was the production of this voluminous amount of artwork made from etchings and engravings, and we're going to see a little bit more of that as we go on. So the next one here, this is another really interesting one. It's a crossbow maker and a bow maker. I think you can see some bows in the back of the workshop. Once again, we've got the master, who you can see, this is the master artisan with his apron. This is a very traditional thing. While they're working, they wear an apron to protect their clothing and keep from getting hurt by sharp tools and such. And then there's a nobleman that he's selling crossbows to, and the nobleman's got his bodyguards or his courtiers with him. I think the shorter guy on the left there may be Tartar. So in the back, you can see that there's a woman working the books in the back of the workshop. This is probably the wife, I'm guessing. And this is a very common situation where the wives did the books in these workshops. Again, the marriage is a partnership. And women in towns like Krakow were educated and taught to read and write. It was very common. Most of the burghers could read and write, at least, and do some math. So they had basic numeracy and literacy. Women were usually educated. Little girls were educated usually up to about the age of 10 or 12. Boys, either, depending on where it was, educated up to the age of 12 or 14. So boys had a little more education, potentially, depending on their estate, how wealthy their parents were and everything. But the city actually, in many of these towns, the city paid for public education, and this isn't the same sort of political breakdown that we have today. They didn't think of it as socialism. That didn't exist then. We just need people who can read and write, because that's how our businesses work these days. Another thing that you'll notice, the window that's made out of the little round discs, this is called crown glass, is one of the terms that's used. But what this meant was there's towns that produce glass. Now, if you're in the Middle Ages, we don't have rail. We don't have airplanes. So if you're traveling, if you're sending your stuff to cities and countries that are far away, big plates of glass are pretty hard to keep from breaking. So what they would do is make these little discs, and they would pack those in a box full of straw and whatnot, and they would send those all over the place. So a lot of glass came from Venice, northern Italy. A lot of glass, actually, in this area came from the Czech region, from Bohemia. But it was also made in towns like Krakow. And so you could ship that around, and then a glazier would put it all together. We're going to see a glazier later. They would put it together with lead and make a window for you. You'll also see that quite often the windows are open so they can let the light in. When they developed glass, that was a big change for the lives of people that lived in these cities, because prior to that, you basically have either just an open window and shutters that you could close, or you have like wax paper or something like that, which means most of the time, if it's a little bit cool, you're going to keep the windows closed. But this really lets the light in, and it just really changed the life for the common folk, especially because glass had become a lot more affordable. You're going to see there's flowers in the window. You'll see that's very common in a lot of these. There's a special machine behind the crossbow master, the crossbow maker, that's for mounting the prod on a crossbow that you'll see in lots and lots of other documents from this era. And you'll see that there's a wash basin in there. That's also very common. Okay, so the next one here, hatters. This is another strange one because both of these guys are not doing their job. They're just wearing armor. And I suspect there's a hidden meaning here. I didn't try to translate what was on this page, but hatters were a lot of times fairly high status in medieval towns, and everybody, all these artisans were in the militia. I'm sorry, forgive me for saying that backwards. Everybody that was of a citizen status in the town, which would include all master artisans, had a militia obligation, and most of the journeymen would as well, in part because each workshop, each household had an obligation to send so many people, and a lot of times they would actually send the younger journeymen to be part of that obligation in terms of militia duty. And sometimes that just meant, sort of ceremonial duty. Sometimes it actually meant wars and raids and sieges and stuff. The towns were quite often fighting with robber knights and bandits and so on. So the fact that these hatters are depicted in full armor, what would be called full harness, is an indication that they were pretty high status in the militia. They may have been mounted. And we also have one of the known fencing masters from roughly this era is a guy called Jörg Wilhelm, aka the Hatter, who is a fencing master. And there's a couple of images from Jörg Wilhelm, and I'll include a link to his page on the Wigton Hour. It's an interesting source. Next one here is a double. We have a wheelwright and a wagon master. So obviously, if you've got a wagon, you need the wheelwright that makes the wheels. And here in this picture, they're fighting. That probably a joke. It could also have a double meaning that there could be a rivalry between the crafts. These crafts would get into rivalries. Sometimes, for example, whenever they would have these big processions on Carnival and during All Saints' Day and so on, the order in which the crafts appeared in the parade, or whether they were even allowed in the parade at all, it reflected their status, and which craft was behind which other craft could be something they would fight about. But probably this is just a joke. They're just the wheelwright and the carters are kind of mad at each other. The next one, this is also to be a funny one. It's a painter, and he's painting a mural up on the top of the wall, and he's kind of like he's wearing his undershirt there. That's a linen shirt. This might be sort of a inside joke. This could be the painter that painted all the illustrations in this book depicting himself. And you can see down below there's a bunch of merchants or maybe nobles discussing something. Maybe their commission that this painter is painting, and you can see he's painting some looks like some soldiers or knights or something up on the wall there. This is the next one here is a potter making pots. This looks like a fairly low status potter right now. The status of each craft varied from town to town. There's some that are almost always high status, like a goldsmith. But a goldsmith, for example, in a town where there's a gold mine nearby is going to be much higher status than a goldsmith where there's just one guy that sells the wedding rings. He might not be that well. And the same thing applies for the lower middling level crafts, like a potter. There's some places where let's say pottery is a really big industry in the town, then a potter is going to be more important. Or that they have they make certain kinds of very high quality pottery. This guy looks very low status. This is another depiction of a potter I think is really cool. That's from a 15th century card deck, also from this area called Hofamterspiel. And this is a lady potter, which again would not at all be unusual in this period. This one, I'm not certain what this craft is. I think this is some kind of tanner, but he's working with hides. You can see that his apprentice is playing cards. Speaking of cards, like the Hofamterspiel deck. So playing cards is another thing that the printing industries in these towns were getting into. They were doing woodblock printing of cards all the way back to the early 15th century, and playing cards became very popular very quick. That was one of the main ways that we entertained ourselves right up into my childhood. Before the internet. If you ever wonder how people kept their sanity before the internet, well, that was one of the ways. And you can also see there's a well in the background there. This is a specific type of well that has this kind of seesaw-looking thing that was just a quick way to pull a lot of water up and out. And you'll see those in all kinds of medieval maps and documents from this era. Next one is a bell founder. This is a guy that would be casting church bells, mainly out of big bells, out of bronze. This was difficult to do, and bronze was expensive. Iron got cheaper and cheaper because iron ore is very ubiquitous, and in the later medieval ages, they learned how to make iron very efficiently in large quantities. But bronze requires, it's both copper, and you have to find tin somewhere. And because tin was a little more rare, copper was too. Actually, it's not as common as iron. So expensive, and this is a difficult job. So you're taking a lot of valuable stuff and making something out of it. And if you do it wrong, it's going to crack, like the Liberty Bell. You can see he's got some noble clients there. This guy doesn't have any cannons, but bell founders made cannons. This is another reason why they were also really prominent and important, and we'll see some of that later. This is another really wonderful painting of a carpenter's workshop, and we can see there's a woman in the background there working the bellows, heating up something iron, and there's various apprentices and journeymen in there working. Yeah, so it's a busy shop, and there's a lot going on, and I'm just going to leave it at that because we've got to keep moving. But there's a lot you can say about each one of these. The next one here, this is a shoemaker, and there's definitely some humor in this one because you can see there's like an old man working in the back, like a bald guy, and then some younger people who are probably journeymen and apprentices working. And in the foreground, a woman this could be a widow who maybe married another guy, or it could just be this older craftsman married a younger wife. And she's got a jester there playing music for her, and her kid is running around the floor, and the kid has pooped on the floor. You look closely there. Medieval humor, man, there's a lot of potty humor. But you can see also that there's some pretty interesting, like nice quality looking shoes up on the shelves there. So there's quite a scene going on this one. The next one is like another double image where we've got a quiver maker and a saddle maker. And so these are probably leather workers. These quivers, there's a specific type of quiver that are made with this fur on it. I think they're partly made out of leather and partly wood, maybe that were for crossbow quarrels. And crossbows was one of the main weapons of the era. Next one is a cutler. This is another really interesting one. We can see once again there's a noble customer with his bodyguard. That might be again possibly a Tartar. That maybe they're just showing the nobleman as taller, just to show he's higher status. But he's got that sarmatist sort of outfit on, and you can see among the apprentices, one of the apprentices there, or journeyman that's working at the table, is a little more darker complected than the others, and I think that guy might be a Tartar or a Turk. There was a fair amount of people moving around from region to region, and ethnicity didn't really have a lot of significance in this period. It's something I'll talk about another time. Next one is a needle maker, and he makes things like sewing needles and maybe nails and stuff like fish hooks. And then the next one is we're not seeing a craftsman at all. We're just seeing some people shooting the popinjay, this is a type of sport that they did in these towns to practice their marksmanship. And it was a big deal for the towns, and I'm going to do a whole nother video on that one day, but not right now. But you can see that there on the left there's some militia. These guys in the armor with the painted shields. Those are going to also be artisans from the town. These towns did not really trust mercenaries to be in their militia. They used mercenaries for external conflicts. If they're fighting, in a long way away, they would hire mercenaries rather than risk their own people. But for the defense of the town and it's close to the town environment, they relied on their own citizens because they didn't trust anybody else. So those are probably that's why they look so bored, which is another very common theme. Whenever you see urban militia, a lot of times they're looking bored. And then on the right, you see the people that are shooting, and they're very elaborately dressed. Again, these big crazy combination of colors and patterns, which is, if you see a modern film or TV show, they're always wearing sort of Judas Priest outfit, or there's weird muted earth tones and stuff. But that's not what medieval artisans look like. Um, and So I have an excerpt from this wonderful Polish chronicler, bishop named Jan Długosz, who talks about an incident that kind of maybe relates a little bit to this. So I'm going to just read this. Uh, this is for the entry for 1455. So this is about 50 years before this book came out. Two disasters now strike the city of Krakow. On the day the new bishop, Thomas Straczynski, is elected, a fine bell with a very pleasing ring, a gift from the late Cardinal Bishop Olezinski, is dislodged and falls and breaks the upper part of one ear, thus making it useless until it can be recast. Then on the following day, fire breaks out on the house of Thomas the Armorer, which is close to the church. The attempt to put it out are half-hearted, for almost all the apprentices are outside of the city shooting at a popinjay or watching others do it, and the wind goes round to the north and the flames break out again and the fire spreads rapidly. So this is just an incident where the chronicler himself, his own house almost burned down, and it was because all the apprentices and probably the journeymen especially, which is a lot of the younger part of the physically active workforce in the town, are these journeyman guys. They were all outside of the city shooting at targets. The popinjay means parrot. The target was usually a wooden parrot that was sort of a 3D puzzle. And if you shot the right piece off, if you shot the head off, for example, you'd get a prize. You'd get a significant amount of money. So it was both target practice and a really popular sport. Okay, so the next one is blacksmith. In this case, we don't get an interior look at the workshop at all, but we get a very interesting look at the streets of Krakow. This is a really interesting, like just a cityscape. What did it look like? You can see there's like some scaffolding in the distance, and they're working on a new building somewhere. Maybe that's part of a church, and you can get a sense of like the on the way to the market. Really interesting look there, although we don't really learn much about the blacksmith. So these two are soap makers, and I love the costumes that these guys have. Again, we're not just looking at like a Judas Priest outfit, although we do have leather. This looks a little more like a 60s kind of Billy Jack, like Native American inspired hippie outfit, or kind of, hipster look to them. That they've got these wonderful, crazy hairdos and mustaches and everything, and you see flowers all over the place because, of course, that's what they're scenting the soap with. Cleanliness is another big issue that I'm also going to do a video on one day. In this era, people did bathe. They did use soap. The soap was a really important commodity. There was the cheaper soap was sort of a liquid that you would buy. That was kind of like the like some of the hand soaps we have today, or the body soap. And then the more expensive soap was in solid bars. And the cheaper was made out of lard and lye, and the more expensive was made out of olive oil, and various perfumes were built into it. So soap was already a big deal. Next to we have a husband and wife and a jester. These are glove makers. This is another playful one. We can see that the husband has a weird look on his face, and the wife is making a sort of maybe a provocative gesture at him a little bit, and who knows what the jester's doing. But this is probably a fun workshop to be in. Certainly going to be a lively one, I think. And next one is a cooper. This is maybe a middle status artisan. It looks like a very busy workshop, and we can see another nice view of Krakow in the background. And then finally, the last one for this book, this is a pair of surgeons. And these are strange. This is a really weird one. I'm not sure if I really want these people to sew up my sword injury. But the track record of these surgeons was actually surprisingly pretty good. Anyway, these two, they're shown with a kind of dark complexion. I think in this case, it might represent the idea that they were working outside fairly often. There was also an association for surgeons with sorcery and alchemy, and that might be why we see the wild man and the monkeys in the background. I think these two monkeys with the giant razors in their hands, those are medieval surgeons' razors that they've got. That's a scary look to me. And you combine that with the wild man, there's some trouble here. But so that's a look at the Balthasar Behem Codex from Krakow in 1505, and it gives us a little insight into what these people's jobs actually was, and then also the sense of humor of the time period, and a little bit of what the city looked like, the urban life. So now we're going to go into the next book. This is the Housebook of the 12 Brothers of Nuremberg, and what it was an almshouse, which means that it was like a charitable foundation, like a retirement home, and it always took care of 12 people because that's how much it was funded for. It was established by a merchant named Conrad Mendel in 1388 in the city of Nuremberg. This was part of what we would call the medieval charity industry, and it was because some changes that the church made that sort of elevated the status of charity. So people that had a lot of money, this is one of the ways, like in my Fugger video, I talk about this is why Jacob Fugger built that great big housing project. It's kind of similar to this, but this is a much smaller scale. But they would basically give up a chunk of money that would be held in a escrow, and that would pay for the upkeep on a building and for the salaries of staff and food and lodging for 12 people perpetually. And this one lasted from 1422 to some point in the 19th century. So it's a really long time. This is another really big book. It's 857 pages, of which there are 765 paintings of different craftspeople, mostly craftsmen. I believe they're watercolors, all of them. This is another handwritten book, and it's obviously over many centuries, so there was many different hands and different artists. The book's in German. This one's a little more serious and sober than the Balthasar Behem Codex. There's a really good website for this one that you can search by the craft. They've actually got a page that has all the artisan crafts industries in English, so you can kind of pick and go see, and you see each individual person. It gives the day that they died, and very, very short, that gives their name and the day they died, basically, and what they did, and that's about it. There's not like really a bio or anything. We'll just dive right into it, though. Okay, so the first one, once again, is a merchant, and this looks a little bit like the other merchant. We got bundles of merchandise. This is probably textiles. It could be silk or linen or wool or fustian or something else like that. The second one we're going to look at, this one's a beer brewer, and when they were brewing beer in this period, they used to put that Star of David that's over the beer vat. That's not necessarily anything to do with Jewish religion. It's Solomon's seal, which was part of kind of a superstitious practice to basically keep your beer from spoiling. It's quite tricky to make beer, especially in an open vat like that, where you don't get it contaminated. So it's very tricky to do that correctly. And beer was a really important industry in a lot of these towns. Next one is a stonemason or a stone cutter. This one's a nail maker, and you can also see somebody shooting a cannon in the background. That means that this guy was probably operating the cannons in the militia, in the town militia. This is another nail maker, and in the background you can see a bellows, which is connected to a water wheel. Those the little connectors on the bellows, that's what that's for. This one's a bookbinder. We can see here's a cook. This kitchen looks a little chaotic. There's a little humor here. This might have been possibly one of the workers at the almshouse. Then we have an apothecary, which is another interesting one. Here we have a bell founder, and there's a cannon in the picture because, again, as I told you before, bell founders made cannons. Here's a double one where we have a brewer on the left and a cooper on the right. This was not double in the original book. This is just the way I found the image online. But brewers and coopers do work together because beer goes into barrels. This one's a weaver. Weaving was a lot of times the primary industry in these towns. Weaving was one of the most important industries throughout Europe, and people needed clothes. You can't be naked. Poland, Germany, most of the year it's too cold to walk around naked, and you don't want to wear fur. So people are wearing textiles. So weaving was really, really important. Here's one with a weaver on the left and a hatter on the right. Here's another weaver, and I think that this guy may be of African origin. Some people might disagree. It's possible that this is just that the paint darkened over time because this is centuries old. The guy's name was Andres Mater, But we do see Africans showing up in a lot of artwork in the 15th and 16th century, and you see a couple images of that here. We should see them in a lot of the fight books, but all kinds of other sources, and we also have them in documentation sometimes. There was a series of sort of duels going on amongst one of the fencing guilds in the city of the Germans called Breslau, and the Poles called Wroclaw or Vretislav to the Czechs. Anyway, let's call it Breslau over to the west. Wroclaw had a series of violent incidents that was going on amongst the fencing guilds, and one of the guys that got in trouble it mentions that he was African. And then we also have Saint Maurice is this depiction of a very important, one of the military saints that was always depicted as a sub-Saharan African. There's no reason why Africans couldn't move, across the sea from North Africa and get picked up on ships and so on. There was no direct, really correlation yet with Africans and slavery at this time. In fact, the chances of being a slave were much higher. And if you're in Krakow, the chances of you getting caught by Mongol slave raid and turned into a slave are fairly high. Anyway, this is another subject for another time. But here's a dyer. This is another really important industry because you want to wear textile clothing and you don't want it to be gray or brown. So if you want to have colors, which you can see in all this other artwork that they often do, you need it dyed. And dyeing is one of these industries that rapidly advanced in the high to late Middle Ages, and they figured out how to use alum to fix dyes, and they figured out all different kinds of new dyes to get different kinds of colors. This one is a cutler who is also a Landsknecht. Landsknecht is a type of mercenary soldier, and cutlers are knife makers that also make swords. Sometimes they do the whole thing in a shop. Like you see here, this guy's making, looks like he's making certainly assembling lots of different swords and knives and daggers. But sometimes these guys would be subcontractors working for other cutlers. So you'd have whole networks. This is something we'll get to more in a minute. This is a common thing where a lot of these artisans were also soldiers. They're all in the militia, at least for a while in their life. Technically, between 16 and 60, you had militia obligation. But if you got seriously injured or if you got blinded or anything like that, then you wouldn't no longer have the obligation, but your household still would. So you'd have to send it. So here's another one. And I'm not sure what craft this is. It looks like some kind of maybe leather worker, but he's also had a double life as a soldier. So if you're in the militia, you're trained, which also gives you the opportunity to go work as a mercenary. So it's unclear to me if these guys are mercenaries or militia, but they were, it wasn't uncommon at all for people to do both, and most artisans had some military experience. This guy is also a cutler, and you can see he's making swords and daggers and knives. And on the wall behind him, there's a winged lion holding two long swords. That winged lion is a depiction that's the Lion of St. Mark, which is the symbol of Venice, but it's also the symbol of the Brotherhood of St. Mark, or the Marksbrüder, which is one of the fencing guilds. So this guy was probably a fencing master. Here's a guy who was a baker, and we can see that there's a bunch of pretzels up on the wall. These are like the big ones. Pretzels were very popular in this era and were sold on the street as street food. Here's another really interesting one to me, which is the gingerbread maker. You can see that they've got nice patterns on the gingerbread cakes and cookies that are just like the kind that you still can get today in that part of the world. Ginger was super popular, and ginger, at least initially, it was being imported down the Silk Road. So this is an indication of the volume of trade. They may have started growing ginger in Europe eventually, but maybe in Southern Europe. But there was so much ginger coming into Germany that it was common even for peasants would have gingerbread and gingerbread cookies and so on around Christmas. And this guy was probably working year round if he had a gingerbread baking operation. That was specific. It doesn't say baker, it says gingerbread maker for this one. This guy's a weigher. Weights and measures is one of the most important rights that cities would get. All the rights would come in different packages as part of these town charters, and they would gradually win more and more of them. This guy probably worked for the city. It's possible he might have worked for a merchant family or a merchant company. Here's a winemaker. Winemaking was something that was usually done in the countryside and managed or owned by nobles and prelates like bishops and archbishops. But the cities did also have some vineyards, and some individual burgher families had vineyards. And then because this one's a charity, we also see some interesting lower status artisans. So here's a chicken carrier. This is a little closer to what people expect from this era. These people also existed. There's a sack carrier. I guess this is guys like a porter kind of. And here's a sawyer. So it's somebody who'll go out and saw wood on a construction site or something like that. A lot of the in this era they had sawmills that were water powered, so you could buy boards. You would have stacks of boards of all different sizes and thicknesses and everything. Uh, but still, you had to do some sawing on site. So this guy was an expert at that, and probably not a very high status craft. So anyway, that's a good look at that. Just an introduction to the hundreds, 700 plus images in that book, and you can go look at more of them online. I highly recommend it. I think it's very interesting. Finally, we're going to get here to the third book, which is called the Ständebuch, or the Stände und Handwerker. Handwerker means craftsman. This is from 1568, also in Nuremberg. It means stalls and craftsmen, or shopkeepers and craftsmen, literally stalls and craftsmen. But that's a euphemism for a shopkeeper. Anyway, this was produced. The art in this was created by a guy called Jost Amann, who was born in Zurich in 1539 and died in 1591 in Nuremberg. He was originally a Formschneider, which means somebody that cuts out the patterns on woodcuts. Woodcuts was the first mass-produced printing method before the movable type. As soon as the paper was available, you start getting lots of woodcuts because people loved it. We still like them today. The difference between a woodcut and like an etching or an engraving is that the woodcut is because it's on wood, it's not going to be quite as fine, and especially once it's been used to press multiple, copies, which is one of the reasons why we have these. Everything that's on a woodcut or on an etching is we're going to have a lot of them because they made more than one, and a lot of times they made hundreds or thousands of them. But gradually the forms get worn out. So the artwork in this one is not quite as clear. It's a little more rough. This guy worked in a workshop with another guy called Virgil Solus in Nuremberg, and the way apparently it worked with the Formschneider is that when you were a journeyman, you would actually have to do the cutting. But once you became a master, a lot of times what you're actually doing is just the sketches, and then you would hand that to the journeyman, and the journeyman would cut the sketch and do it mirror image and cut it into the wood, and you would supervise and make sure they did it right. So these were probably not physically cut by Jost Amann, but they were supervised, let's say, by him. And then each one of these images is accompanied by a poem by a guy called Hans Sachs, who's kind of a famous poet and what's called a Meistersinger, which were these urban. A lot of them were craftsmen who were dabbling in composing, and I'm going to make another video one day. I know I'm promising lots of videos that I'm going to kind of make the argument that this was sort of the precursor for a lot of what became the Baroque music and whatnot, but that's debatable. But all the depictions in this one are from the 1560s, so it's a very specific kind of fashion and look that's very different from what we were seeing before. That you're going to see short hair, not as many hats, the slashed clothing that shows your fancy underwear, the sort of puffy pants, puffy thighs, which are called Pluderhosen. And it's good if you have any familiarity with the HEMA historical fencing world. These guys look like they're walked right out of a Joachim Meyer fight book. This one's also a little bit more playful than the last one. So, and this is another really big one. And I forgot to check how many pages it is, but I got 50 images in this one, or maybe 60, I think. Anyway, I'm going to jump right into it. And this is just a taste. So I'm also going to translate a couple of the poems. These are very rough translations because I have to translate it from Fraktur script, and my German's not that great, and using help from software. So the translations are a little rough, but I did work and talk to some friends and double check that I at least have the general meaning correct. So here's the first one. This one's actually not an artisan, but I included it just because it's funny and interesting. This is the Jakobsbruder, and the poem explains what it is. The poem says, "We Jacob's brothers have run back and forth with a large group in the country, from St. Jacob to Rome, singing and begging without shame, like other poor people. May the better folk take pity on us, otherwise we'll remain lazy beggars all our lives." So you see these guys, they've got pilgrim staffs on, and they've got all these little badges. Those are pilgrims badges. And what these guys did was they were freelance pilgrimage takers. So if you got in trouble in the Middle Ages, you had an option of whether you went to the civic court or the nobility for as the princely court, or to the church court. And if you went to the church, a lot of times they were going to make you do penance, and one of the main forms of penance was to go on a pilgrimage. But you could apparently hire these Jacob people to go on the pilgrimage for you, and that's what they did for a living. They just went marching back and forth from towns to these pilgrimage sites, like down the way of St. James or down to Rome, or all the way maybe. I don't know if they went across, sailed across to Jerusalem. That would probably cost too much, but you could probably hire them to do that too. Anyway, that's kind of an amusing one, but it's not really an artisan. The next one here is an apothecary, and I wanted to take a little detour on what an apothecary was. A friend of mine, Dory, was just in this town called Cluj in, I probably mispronounced that, but it's in Romania, in the region of Transylvania, and I believe it was partly a Saxon town. There's a bunch of, just like in Poland, that some of these towns were surveyed by the Germans. Anyway, Plunge, you can see some pictures of the 16th century apothecary that was there. So an apothecary is like a pharmacy, basically. And there were pharmacies a little bit like this still when I was a kid here in New Orleans. There's one called Royal Pharmacy on Royal Street that really reminds me of it quite a bit. One of the details in this image here, you can see there's a sign explaining one of the remedies, which was a sort of a nodule that grows inside of a crab that they would take out, and it's pure calcium carbonate, which, if you know anything about medicine, that's a good stomach cure for among other things. And so they sold that as like a pill to cure stomach ailments or to alleviate stomach pain, which, because it was almost pure calcium carbonate, probably worked. And this is something that we'll see with medieval medicine showing up quite often. This is another apothecary in Tallinn, which used to be called Reval in Estonia. This one is actually all the way back to 1422 and still operates as a pharmacy. Places like this, you could get pills, which were kind of being created at this time, medicinal powders, tinctures, oils and extracts. You could get bandages. They'd have all kind of herbs like sage and thyme and rue, aloe. You get incense, gems and stones, some of which are supposed to have medicinal properties. There's also some weird stuff like so-called supposed mummy juice that would be like, I guess, mummy bandages that were soaked in water or something. I don't know what that was for. Powdered unicorn horn, which is actually a narwhal tooth from Norway that was supposed to be, Viagra. I probably did not work. Don't recommend trying that. But a lot of everyday things like jam and sort of cookies, aqua vitae, which is alcoholic spirits, like vodka kind of type spirits. Gunpowder you could get in these places, and treats like marzipan, which supposedly the pharmacy there, the museum in Tallinn, says that's where they invented marzipan. I don't know if that's true or not, but alcoholic spirits was like a big thing that they sold in these apothecaries. That's why there used to be they used to talk about serving spirits, get brandy or something in it by the dram, and that's because from the old association with the apothecary. And there's something there that they sold there called teriac, which is a concoction that was supposed to be a cure for snake bites, among many other things, but it had a lot of ingredients, but one of the ingredients was opium, and so this is one of the early opiate medicines that you could use to reliably alleviate pain, and it was also an effective cough suppressant. And this was in the era a little bit before, when Paracelsus, a little later in the 16th century, Paracelsus basically streamlines the production of laudanum, which it became like a kind of predictable dosage for opium that you could use for surgeries and things like that. And once again, here you can see the husband and the wife in this picture of. This is from another book called the Tacunium Sanitatis, which is a book of health remedies and dietary advice. You can see where the husband and wife running the shop, and they're selling that teriac potion. So the next one here is a print die maker, and I couldn't figure out what this was, so I had to translate the poem. Again, rough translation, but this is what I got. I cast the font for the printing press, made from lead, tin, and antimony. I can adjust them well, arrange the letters together, Latin and German script, which also applies to the Greek language, with capitals, dots, and lines so they fit into the printing form. So that pretty much explains it. Somebody's got to make all the little metal fonts for the printer, and that's the guy who does it. So here's the next guy. This is a scribe. It looks like he's actually sketching something. He might get himself in trouble with the artist's craft. And you can see he's got a sword in the background. Again, all these artisans were armed. You actually were obligated to own a sword if you were a master artisan. And contrary to what some people will tell you, in these towns, most of the towns, for most of the estates, down to the lower middling level of the craftsmen, you were allowed to actually carry a sword when you were walking around. Sometimes these would get curtailed or adjusted during civil disturbances and when there's uprisings and stuff. But the majority of the time, in the majority of towns, you could walk around with swords, and you'll see people wearing swords all the time in the artwork from this period in these areas. Next one is a Formschneider. So this is like the guy who made this book. Poem reads, I'm a good Formschneider. That's what they do to me for tearing. With the quill on a linden board, I'll cut with my tool. When you print it, it's sharp. The picture, as he designed it, it stands because it prints on the paper. It's almost artificial because it's impossible to paint. These woodcuts, obviously, they're monochrome, but sometimes people would color them, and you'll see some colored versions here and there in this. Next one is a paper maker. So a lot of times, all these printing and bookmaking industries and the art industries start with a paper mill, and in Nuremberg has the first proven paper mill that we know of from in this part north of the Alps, in this part of Europe. The poem reads, I need rags for my mill where the waters drive my wheel so that I can make a bow from felt while pressing the water out. Then I hang it up to let it dry, snow white and smooth, the way people like it. So they're already bleaching the paper. So the paper was, kind of where it all starts. And it wasn't just for the production of books, but also people use it for private correspondence, for notes, for invoices, for doing everything to do with their business. It really, the fact that the paper became so much more ubiquitous in this era really helped boost. It was a sort of an add-on to all the other economic activity. This one is a printer or a book presser, it says, I think is what the translation came out to. So, and you can see here, this guy's actually, those little things he's got in his hand, that's how you put the ink on the pages when you're printing a book. Next one is a letterpress artist, was the closest translation I could get. Other close terms would be printmaker or a broadside maker or a pamphlet maker. The poem says, I am a letterpress artist. With the pen, I get more and more painting pictures standing there like that on paper or parchment with colors and with gold. I don't like cartridges to do bad work. This also includes small wages. So I guess they're saying this guy doesn't make a ton of money. Next one is the book binder. So the one guy was printing the pages in the book. This guy is the one who puts the books together. And this combination of the last several crafts all comes together to make a book like this. And this is very typical in the craft industries, where a lot of crafts would work together, and they would specialize to keep the high level of quality, the sort of bespoke quality of every part of the process, while also making the volume high so that they could produce lots of stuff. And that was also done with the textile industry and the shipbuilding, furniture making, sword making, armor making, all kinds of other stuff. This one's a painter. It says a hand painter specifically. The poem reads, the art of perspective is pure. I can give the person his appearance with color as if the picture were living in a place. Castles, water, mountain on forest, an army, famously a prince's palace. I can actually show it as if it was standing there in the flesh. That one actually reads pretty well. My translations are obviously very hit and miss. This one's a glazier. Again, we see that the discs, the crown glass, he's putting that together, and once he's done connecting them all with lead, you can put it in your window. This one's a glass painter who's probably maybe making something like stained glass. Here's a gold embroiderer, and we can see the guy's wife is coming and helping him, and we see a cat. These people had pet cats, not surprisingly. Once again, we got the open window, and you can see those glass discs in the window. Here's a goldsmith. So I'm going to launch another brief aside on goldsmith. Here's a wonderful painting by Petrus Christus from 1449 from Flanders. showing a goldsmith, and we can see like a wealthy urban couple probably buying a wedding ring or something, and we can see this guy's beautiful workshop, and he's got like a little miniature painting. I call that the down on the bottom right. I call that the medieval iPad, but I think it's a little painting with a kind of a lens glass cover that sort of lets expands it a little bit, zooms in on it. We get a lot of depictions of Saint Eligius, who was the patron saint of goldsmiths, but he's also broadly a patron saint for artisans. And again, as I mentioned before, represents sort of upward mobility for artisans. And this is a nice depiction by what I think this is the master of the Amsterdam Gambit. This is one of these anonymous artists, but you see the monkey and a dog, cat, some birds very amorous together, and a mouse all in the same room. These monkeys are showing up a lot in medieval art, and apparently they had monkeys, because I found some records of like people getting bit by monkeys. Anyway, I don't know how they got them there or how they kept them alive in the winter, but they were very popular, at least conceptually, and once in a while, at least some people had them. Here's a gem cutter. You can see it's got a machine with a treadle on the bottom there. That's a little bit like an old-fashioned sewing machine. That was probably running a grinder or a drill. Here's a sculptor, and not surprisingly, his workshop. This is one of the messiest, most chaotic workshops out of all these. Here's a merchant. This is probably like a petty merchant. The poem reads, "I am a tradesman. I carry many types of merchandise: furs, food, wine, wool and flax, satin, silk, honey, and wax, and other truths mentioned here. I lead them in and out of the land with great care and fear whenever misfortune strikes me." So again, we're talking about the risks of the open road. Here's a mint master. This is the guy who's going to be minting coins. This is a very important high status job. This is a peddler, which is the bottom end of a mercantile type job. This is a very petty trader who's itinerant, like roaming around. We have a lot of complaints in the records up in the northern part of Germany and in the region of northern Poland, which was called Prussia, where they were complaining about all the English peddlers that showed up who were selling stuff and becoming a nuisance. This one, I think the direct translation was sutler, but I think this is a sutler is somebody that supplies merchandise to military, but I think this is like a petty grocer or shopkeeper. This one's a belt maker. I think this is some kind of a skinner. This is a miller who's milling grain. Mills were super important in this era. A grain mill that was powered by a water wheel could grind as much grain in an hour as 50 slaves in the Roman Empire could. And in the Middle Ages, what that meant is that you had a lot of excess free labor time, and that would go to things like establishing a baker or a beer brewer or something. Millers also ran mills they ran sawmills, they ran trip hammer and forge mills, wire pulling mills, all different other kinds of mills. So these water powered mills and some wind powered and some animal powered mills were like very, very important for the artisan industries. It did a lot of the boring part of the work, so that the artisan could focus on the creative and high skill parts. Here's a baker. You see the journeyman kneading dough in the back, and you can see the master and his wife there. Here's a beer brewer. Here's a tailor. I think this literally says cloth cutter. Here's another furrier, and we know that furriers are quite important, as I was saying before. Here's the poem. "We furriers now also take the prize. The Lord God put us in paradise. So the one who was the first furrier, as read in the first book of Moses, since Adam and Eve after the fall, from the Garden of Eden for dinner," I probably mistranslated that part, "in the cold and frost were emerging. God made us naked and bare skin." So they're kind of joking around about how, fur is the first clothing, right? And that emphasizes the importance of the fur. We have actually a colorized version of this one, and there's a stained glass window version depicting this one that also has color. It's kind of neat. This one's a linen weaver, hatter, really interesting barber, and you see a lot of details here that looks a lot like a modern barber shop. You've got a basin where the guy's he's got another basin with holes in it that he can open up, and it's like a shower, and so he's washing the guy's hair just like you get at a barber today. And you see all the little jars with antiseptic in them that had, and they didn't probably know that they didn't have germ theory then, but they did use stuff like that. They used this strong vinegars and stuff that would help preserve things. So it looks a lot like a barbershop from the 60s or 70s in some ways, except for the barber's got a sword, and he's wearing Pluderhosen. Here's a guy who's a tooth puller. This is a kind of scary one. Bath attendant again. So public baths were really common and still are actually in Central Europe, and like in Germany, it's still a big industry. This guy is putting cups on the backs of these women. This is like something they do in spas to this day, and I don't really understand what it's supposed to do exactly, but they still do it, so I guess there's something to it. These baths could either be kind of like a sauna, which is more especially common in Poland and in northeastern Europe. The Slavic term is banya. There's other terms for that too, but or it could be a hot soaking bath. A lot of times they have a lot of hot springs throughout Europe, and so towns that have hot springs, they would always have like a public bath industry. And people believed that the hot springs were good for your health. You notice also this amusing detail that there's a baby in its own bath because nobody wants to be in the bath water with the baby, but the baby's sort of strapped to a board so it can't get in trouble. It can't fall over. It's kind of clever. I like it. Here's a bell founder, and sure enough, there's a cannon in there. Thimble maker, and literally the German term I think is finger hatter, which I think is pretty funny. A brush maker, which literally the term was brush tire. Ties the brush, ties all the horsehair or whatever to make the brush. This is a comb maker, I think. This one, I believe, is a tool maker. I think it said circle smith, but the poem, I couldn't quite translate the poem, but it mentions pliers and compass, so I think it's a tool maker. Here's a cutler. We've already talked about cutlers a lot. Here's one type of coppersmith making pots and bowls. Here's a gunsmith. Guns already pretty important thing in the 15th century and certainly very important by the 16th. Here's a clockmaker. Clocks again. That was another really. This is going to be a high status job. The artisans that made all the parts for the clock, a lot of times for some of the big clocks, like the one in Prague or the one in Strasbourg, they would work with a university trained astronomer, astrologer type person or mathematician that could do all the math, so they could figure it out together. And then they also, like in Nuremberg, this is where they invented arguably the first watch, which was a small portable clock, maybe about the size of a pool ball or an apple or something, in the early 16th century. Nuremberg was a major center for clockmaking. This guy is some kind of a shearer. I couldn't figure it out precisely what it was, but I think that's wool that he's cutting, and I just threw this one in there because I love the giant shears. It's super weird. This is another copper worker. I think it says red smith, something like that. I've seen this term before. I believe it means people that work with brass and bronze. But they making all different kinds of things, not just the big pots. This is an armor maker that makes plate armor. Some regions, Nuremberg made a fair amount of armor, but it wasn't a super heavy-duty armor-producing town like Augsburg. And in the places where the armor industry was a lot bigger, they would be very specialized. So you'd have a lot of different steps. Some people just made the helmet. Some people made gloves. Some people just made the iron plates, and then those would go to people that made the other things out of them. Some people did the tempering and so on. This is just a smith, and we can see there's a horse waiting to get shoes, I think. This one's a bell maker, and it's for a different kind of bell, not big bronze church bells, but little silver bells. And you can see the wife here working with the husband. It's kind of a nice scene, and the kids running around with a hobby horse, getting ready to knock all the bells on the floor, probably. Here's a needle maker. Again, they made all kinds of things with the needles, and they used to make these. They had these wire drawing mills. Mail armor. So this is one of the things they made out of the wire. So one of the first inventions for wire was a wire pulling board that they could pull the wire through the board even more evenly instead of having to hammer it out on a anvil. But mail was never quite automated and mechanized as much as plate armor. So actually, as plate armor got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because of the efficiency of these workshops, the mail armor only decreased in price to a point. And mail armor by this time, this one's made in the 1560s, is really more like it's armor for wearing under your clothing in the city. So something famously George Silver, the fencing master in England, complained that the Italian fencing masters wore mail under the clothing, and that's why they fenced so recklessly. He said they didn't emphasize their defense enough. But people did sometimes wear mail under their clothing or as sort of backup underneath your other types of armor. And you could get very, very expensive, very fancy mail was available in this period. You could get tempered mail, you could get mail that was very, very fine links and so on. Here's a crossbow maker, again, still important, still used as a weapon at this time in the 1560s, but it was being phased out as in the battlefield in favor of firearms by this point, but still quite popular for hunting, especially hunting from horseback, interestingly enough. This guy makes scales, scale maker. Again, weights and measures, big thing for the towns, but these are probably for private use. This guy's a lantern maker, and just as a side note, magic lanterns, like you see in some maybe horror movies and things, where they, the old kind of lantern that goes around, you can wind it up and it'll go round and round, and it makes projects an image to cut holes in the brass. They were making sort of so-called magical image projectors like that show up in some of the war books from the 15th century. Here's a mirror maker, and the poem reads, "I make the bright mirror glass, I let it be painted with bleach, and then I turn the thin panes in which the mirror glasses remain. The ones I use with colors, I make heavy mirrors in which the light appears large so that you can see it properly and finely." I probably messed up that translation, but it's you get the vague idea, Here's a stone cutter. Somebody's got to cut the stones out first before you can make them into building walls and so on, before the mason gets his hand on them. Here's a brick maker, same kind of thing. And a lot of sort of northeastern Europe, especially in the more swampy areas, they made stuff out of bricks where they didn't have as much stone. And they learned how to make really strong brick that you could use for fortifications. Here's one type of carpenter called a Zimmerman. And I have a buddy named Lenny Zimmerman. So hi, Lenny, if you're listening to this. And this is another type of carpenter called a Schreiner. And I don't know precisely what the difference is between those two types of carpenters. And here's a really nice one. This is a singer, and I didn't know what was going on here, so I had to translate the poem. And you see some men and women together, and apparently they're singing together a cappella. So the poem reads, "We have notated good singing that is performed in 4 voices, tenor, treble, alto, and bass, with a beautiful polite third, so sweetly concordated together and so overly sonorated that it lifts the heart. Singing was invented by Amphion." Amphion was a classical figure from classical literature who allegedly built the city of Thebes by playing a song on his lyre. So that's pretty neat. And by the way, there's a lot of classical references in the poems. I only translated a handful of them, and because I'm not that good at it, but these people were a lot more focused on the classical world. You don't get a lot of biblical references in these. Here's a lute maker. There's a bunch of musicians. I only included a couple of them. An organist. And here we have, it says harper and lutenist. These all look like Renaissance techno bands or metal bands to me. I really love these depictions, and I would show more because there's another 7 or 8 of them. But again, here's an introduction to this wonderful period source. And then finally, here we have the eating fool. And that's what I'm going to be when I finish this up. I'm going to go have lunch. So to kind of wrap this up, this source really goes into a lot of detail. This last book is made for the general public. The first one is guild regulations for somebody on the city council or something, the Balthasar Behem Codex, and then that Housebook of the 12 Brothers. All the paintings they're kind of an homage to the people that they took care of that were living in this retirement home. This last one is made as part of the industry to for the amusement of people to buy and look at all the different crafts and everything. But I think it's pretty accurate because it does jibe with many other sources that I've seen. You can decide for yourself, because I have a link to this one, to all 3 of them in the notes. A lot of the context for this is stuff that I cover in my book, The Codex Guide to the Medieval Baltic, which you can pick up through Purple Heart Armory or on DriveThruRPG or through my website. And you can visit my website. I have all kinds of other things, codexintegrum.com and jeanhenrichandler.com. And I have links. And if I probably made some mistakes in some of my translations of the poems and so on, feel free to correct me in the comments. And if you know of other sources, like, hey, if you got a full English translation of Balthasar Behem Codex that you want to let me know about, please let me know about that, because I would love to read all that. One day we'll get it translated otherwise, but that takes a while. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it interesting. I think the craftsmen are very important. The craftsmen and women are very important in this era. And they literally shape these places that are so beautiful and so striking, that places like Venice and Bruges and Nuremberg and Krakow that are still bringing in billions of dollars every year in tourist revenue because of just how amazing they are. And that is the production of masons and carpenters and brick makers and glass cutters and all these other jobs in this period in which people were able to do work at the highest level that they could, and that they could take enormous pride in the creative process. And and even a common worker was doing something that they felt quite justifiably was elevated. That for them, that was their expression of God, was creating beautiful things and creating as a collective endeavor amongst all the other artisans in these communities. They were creating a world that, just outside the town walls, it's warfare and mayhem and craziness going on, but the walls protected them, and inside the walls, along with their militia duty they did to keep the place safe, they had these amazing oases of beauty and art that were, every piece of these buildings was a work of art. When you go to Bruges, or you go to Siena, you'll see this yourself. And if you're curious about this strata that built a lot of what created the Renaissance and the late medieval world, you have access to these sources. They're there for you to look at, and I hope you do. And yeah, let me know what you think, and we'll talk to you next time.